Within 2 minutes of joining any discussion about politics and war, you will be hit by the same statement. There are only a few relevant alliances. Surely different alliances are relevant depending on the discussion. No, that's not what they mean. When players talk about relevancy, they are referring to the competition to win the game. They claim a handful of alliances have accumulated all the wealth and wield all the political power. And downstream from that, they argue that only a few players manage all the wealth and orchestrate all the wars. So are they correct? I hate to say it, but yes. Though in the words of a weeb, just because they're correct doesn't mean they're right. Most of the time they're just parroting old propaganda and assume the only disparity between alliances is in score. I award them no points, and may the admin have mercy on their soul. The objectives of this video are to reform that toxic debate into a constructive one, to explain the inequality between alliances, and to list those alliances that stand above the rest. How do we reform the relevancy debate? Congratulations, you've already taken the first step by clicking on this video to learn more about it. Share the video or the ideas in it with the people you're debating, and some of those cynics might realize they're not climbing an impossibly tall mountain. They're climbing a series of smaller mountains, and the goal is always in sight. Let's start with wealth inequality. The cities, infrastructure, land improvements, military units, and projects of every nation in the game is public information. You can use this to figure out exactly how much material wealth each nation, alliance, and sphere has. The only thing we cannot account for is how much is on their nations and is in their alliance bank. The top 4 alliances account for 30% of the wealth in the top 50 alliances. That's mildly worrying. The top 10 alliances account for 55% of the wealth in the top 50 alliances. That is more worrying. New alliances should be striving to have material wealth comparable to those in the top 10. That is the goal you are trying to reach, and the way you reach it is by increasing your income. Unfortunately, that is complicated. The cost of cities increases exponentially, but income is linear. Your first city and your 10th city produce the same income. So an alliance with hundreds of members and a low average city count should produce the same as a large alliance with less members, right? No. There are 3 things that break the game in favor of older players. First is the population bonus. After a year, then the population of your cities increases by 100,000, and you get a huge amount of extra income. Second is that you can build projects which increase your income dramatically. They are expensive and it takes a long time to get a return on investment, so they are not particularly suitable for new alliances which struggle with member retention. Third is completely political. There is more conflict between smaller nations than larger ones, and this means larger nations can buy more expensive infrastructure and not lose their entire investment at random. It's impossible to tackle the first 2 problems, but you can solve the third by avoiding conflict. If you're not interested in avoiding war, then you should raise taxes. I made a video explaining why high taxes on loans are way more efficient than low taxes, so check that out if it interests you. You should find it easy to get low interest loans from the larger alliances. They literally have more money than they know what to do with, and for them the interest on the loans is greater than the income another city would provide. So loans are mutually beneficial. Recapping wealth inequality. The old alliances have accumulated way more wealth than the new alliances, and for the time being their income is much higher. It is possible for new alliances to rival them after 3 or more years of following good practices, or by absorbing other alliances. Just because new alliances aren't relevant today doesn't mean they can't be relevant tomorrow. On to political inequality. Some alliances are far more influential and well-liked than others. Economic success should correlate with political success, but most of the time it doesn't. I think there are a few reasons for this. The most obvious reason is that alliances with more active members are louder. Economic power doesn't determine an alliance's share of public attention, since anyone can make an account and post on Discord or the forums. Another reason is that only a few alliances bribe others, and send aid to their allies to engender loyalty. It is remarkable how much influence can simply be bought, but for some reason most alliances never think to do it, and many of those that do have to hide it from their members, lest they be accused of wasteful spending. Finally, we have tall poppy syndrome. The more successful an alliance becomes, the more people want to cut them down. This behavior arises naturally in a competitive environment where success is measured by relative advantage, but some alliances do it deliberately, bombarding their adversaries with negativity to break social bonds and destroy that alliance's reputation. The final objective is often to pressure the target to make reforms that are favorable to them, or to weaken and destroy the target entirely. If you don't believe alliances do this, or you want to understand it better, then I suggest you read about failure cascades in EVE Online. There are 2 levels to politics and war, the alliance level and the individual level. Everything I've said until now concerns the alliance level, but the individual plays an extremely important role in diplomacy. Diplomacy, and therefore political influence, is mostly networking. Your alliance's chief diplomat regularly talks to their counterparts in other alliances, and tries to build a rapport that can be used to get information. With that information in hand, they can craft a mutually beneficial strategy and convince their counterparts to follow it. The more likable, more experienced, and better connected diplomat has greater influence than a novice, regardless of their alliance's strength. A lot of Politics and War's diplomats joined the NationSim community in 2006 and 2014, and there is a massive experience gap between the older diplomats and the newer diplomats, since the game's population has dramatically increased in recent years. The top diplomats are not going to develop amnesia anytime soon, so political inequality will continue to persist. The only way for new alliances to overcome this is to build networks with other new alliances, and to add older players to their team of diplomats. What is a great power? Some alliances are wealthy, and some alliances are influential, and only alliances that are both have the potential to become great powers. That's right, potential, because if you learned anything from the last section, it's that when you boil it down, great powers are defined by high member retention. That's the secret. Just keep people playing and be competent. As for how we distinguish great powers from potential powers, there are a few methods. The easiest to judge is an alliance's material power. How many members they have, how many cities they have, the total value of all their cities, projects, infrastructure, land, and other observable assets, the estimated size of their alliance bank, and their tiering. The best method is more subtle. Alliances are often as powerful as those who consider them peers. There is a noticeable difference in how alliances treat each other. Smaller alliances are dismissed. Mid-range alliances are pandered to, since they might switch sides in the future. And other large alliances, peers, are treated with sometimes polite hostility. I'm going to list the alliances I consider to be great powers, and describe their character and recent history. I'll put the facts about their material powers on screen. If you're not on the list, then blame your diplomats. Or don't. Perhaps they're deliberately trying to go unnoticed. So who are the great powers? Rose, the Syndicate, the Knights Radiant, Grumpy, the Immortals, Cataclysm, Commonwealth, the Fighting Pacifists, Eclipse, and Camelot. Some honorable mentions: Guardian, Carthago, and Serpentis. Rose is one of the 3 superpowers of Politics and War, and depending on the day, the strongest alliance in the game. They have small nations, big nations, and everything in between. For the past few years, they have led multiple secret coalitions and worked tirelessly against whichever sphere was the strongest. Despite being the largest alliance in the game, they chose not to keep any other public allies to avoid being attacked. And shockingly, this worked for a long time. The safest place to be isn't beside the king, it's on the fringes of the mob coming to oust him. The Syndicate is the 2nd superpower of Politics and War, and the wealthiest alliance in the game. A few years ago, their entire government and much of their membership was replaced, and the legacy of that event is still being worked out today. They led one of the most powerful spheres in the game, and they excel with hard power and public diplomacy in complete contrast to Rose. When the Syndicate has a rival, everyone knows, because they'll publicly denounce their target and try to rally the rest of the community to do the same. If Rose is on the fringe of the mob, the Syndicate is at its center, lighting the first torch. The Knights Radiant is the 3rd superpower of Politics and War, and one of the most resilient alliances in the game. They have lost a number of wars in the past few years, and when they haven't lost, they've taken a lot of damage. It's difficult to talk about the Knights Radiant because unlike Rose and the Syndicate, which can both admit to being villains depending on the day, the Knights Radiant's identity is being the hero, being the honorable knight. This attitude is very useful for building an alliance, but it is not pragmatic foreign policy. They are constantly acting in their own self-interest, and often get accused of acting dishonorably and being hypocrites. If you embrace being selfish, then you're disliked. If you deny being selfish, but act selfishly, you're the greatest hero today, and the worst villain tomorrow. Grumpy is best defined as quality over quantity. They are the only alliance in the game I'm aware of that has an entrance fee, and very strict requirements on who can join. Grumpy is perhaps the greatest modern power of politics and war, which is strange since all their members are extremely old players. Grumpy started when large nations, often called whales, left the other big alliances to avoid paying taxes, which were used to develop new nations. This should have been a recipe for disaster, but Grumpy became very attractive to all the other large alliances that were still trapped paying taxes, and over the course of several years, almost all the large nations in the game have concentrated in this one alliance. It is now almost impossible to replicate Grumpy. What makes them special now isn't the low taxes, it's their dominance in the upper tier. Those that join them are almost guaranteed to win wars. The Immortals is just a mass member alliance. Their political strategy and their growth strategy was quantity over quality, or more charitably, quantity has a quality of its own. They accepted a lot of members other alliances would decline, and they allied alliances that were ignored by the superpowers. They've changed over time, and they're moving towards becoming a more elitist organization. They've already cancelled all those allies they raised up from nothing. I don't know what will happen to them, but you can definitely learn from their past. The best way to catch up to the great powers is to pay attention to the things they overlook. The Commonwealth has betrayed just about every alliance they've been allied to. It's kinda surreal how many people saw it coming and still allied them. Anyhow, they have tried many different strategies to grow, but the most interesting is definitely exploiting the weaknesses of their neighbors. Their success is purely a result of political pragmatism. The Fighting Pacifists started as an alliance that did not require Discord, forums, or any other application process. If you applied, then you'd become a full member in 24 hours. There were no loans, no strategies, and announcements were rare. There was this weird cycle where they'd reach 150 or more members and 4 to 30 members during wars, and then after the war they'd reach 150 members again. This could have been a very profitable exercise, but they also didn't tax. The modern TFP has strict requirements and does require members join Discord. They do debt trap, which is less than ideal. Politically, they are now imitating the Immortals, and allying those alliances which have been forgotten by the other great powers. Cataclysm is an example of merging to create a great power. There were almost half a dozen mergers which led to the creation of Cataclysm, and they have an extensive government because of that. I don't know if they will survive, since 90% of mergers fail. It's a testament to the talent of their diplomats that they've been able to create and lead a sphere of their own, and to give their membership common enemies which might help unite them. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from Cataclysm. Eclipse is a great power. How they became one and what that means is sort of unclear. They started as a protectorate of the Syndicate, and just gradually grew their material power. The Syndicate has developed a number of remarkably successful protectorates, so it might be worth paying attention to what they're teaching, and not what Eclipse is imperfectly applying. Camelot is easily the most controversial addition to this list, since they have very little material and political power relative to the other great powers. They shouldn't be relevant, but everything they do captures the game's attention and dramatically changes it. Almost all the political change for the past 2 years was initiated by Camelot. For context, the other great powers have been members of 1 or maybe 2 spheres. Camelot has been a member in 4 in the past year and disbanded 3 of them. Currently they are just chilling and growing, non-relevant behavior. However, this is following a war, which another commentator beautifully described.
I've never seen this happen. I've been playing this game for almost 7 years now, and I've never seen an alliance lose so hard and yet do this where they get these kind of peace terms.
Camelot is a perfect example of how thinking outside the box can allow you to reshape the game. In conclusion, it's possible to tackle the inequalities of politics and war, but it does require a lot of work and ingenuity. Whatever you think of Elon Musk, here's a great quote which I think crystallizes this idea. If you're entering anything where there's an existing marketplace against large, entrenched competitors, then your product or service needs to be much better than theirs. It can't be a little bit better. They'll always trust the big brand, unless there's a big difference. Like and subscribe if you found this video helpful, and if you have something to say on the topic, then leave a comment. Thanks.